voice here. Thank you. And what am I looking for? Oh, yeah.
What?
Okay. Somebody still got their audio on. I think that was you, Sheree. Anyway, we're here in Hebrews 3. And so, you know, I like this greater, Jesus greater than, you know, because it's kind of like the a theme with Hebrews or whatever, you know, is greater than, Jesus greater than. So the gist of this chapter, just to kind of remind you where we were at last week, was that that the last couple of weeks is that we had, you know, Jesus being greater than the angels. And, you know, to which of the angels did God say, you know, all of these son comments, or sit at my right hand and be on my throne, and those sorts of things, right? And then we also got kind of like a teasers of what the writer of Hebrews likes to do, is that is to kind of throw out a theme and then go on to something, and then later on build on that thing that he had said earlier, right? So, you know, you'll see something, he'll mention Melchizedek, but then he doesn't really get into Melchizedek until like the next chapter, a couple chapters later. And so we see this kind of like teasing out of things, and then going onto the next thing. But we got a little bit of a glimpse into Jesus being greater than the rest of the priesthood, like the Levitical priesthood, or Jesus being greater than the law. And we also discussed how a thing that you could say is a theme in Hebrews is not only that Jesus is greater than, but that Jesus is the real thing that the law and all of these biblical stories modeled, so that that they become types of things that Jesus is the reality of. So Jesus is the reality. The things that came before him, including the law and the prophets and the temple system, were modeled after realities that he would fulfill. So the gist of this chapter, and it's a short chapter, but I'm going to try to tackle two kind of big themes that'll help us in the rest of the book. But the gist of chapter 3 is that Jesus is not only greater than angels as a son, which we discussed in chapters 1 and 2, but he's also greater than Moses, and also as a son, because Moses acted as a servant in God's house, but Jesus is the builder of that house, and he's also the inheritor of that house. And then he's going to go on to, we are that house. In other words, that we, the saints, the believers, including Old Testament, including New Testament saints, are that house if we stay faithful. And I say if because there are continuous warnings within Hebrews not to stray away from the faith, and to hold fast and endure to the end, and to stay faithful, and not to drift away. So the message of this chapter very much is to stay faithful, or like the unfaithful generation of Israel that was in the desert, out in the wilderness, will miss out on God's rest. Okay, and we'll talk about what God's rest is. So don't harden your hearts like they did in the wilderness and missed out on his rest. So verses 1 through 6 says, therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling. I'll just read this straight through and then we'll go back and kind of break it apart. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle, and the high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that were spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. We are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. So let's look at verse 1 again. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling. That heavenly calling is a calling to serve on God's divine counsel. So it's a calling to it's not a calling to like move away from earth and come here to heaven. It's a calling to be part of the heaven community that is destined to rule. That's what the heavenly calling is. So holy brothers, that word holy brothers, it's like connected to saints, right? And brothers, he's using the word brothers here because he's already talked about how Jesus considers us brothers, not just so we have someone who is ruling in heaven who is saying to the Father, these are my brothers. If you remember the Psalms that we were looking at, he's not ashamed to call us his brothers and sisters or his brethren. And he gets that from Psalm 22, right? You who share in this heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle. It's weird here that like he says apostle. It sounds weird to our ears because when we hear the word apostle, we think of the apostles, Apostle Paul, Apostle Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But an apostle, the word just means the sent one. Okay, if like I, Paul, an apostle of Jesus, means I, Paul, a sent one of Jesus. Okay, but here he's this writer is pointing out that Jesus is the sent one. He was sent out on a mission, and he's also our high priest, the high priest of our confession. When we talked about the high priest, ironically, of course, Jesus couldn't function as a high priest in the Jerusalem system, but and he wouldn't even been allowed into the Holy of Holies because he wasn't a Levite. But he is the priest of all priests, and so the high priest of our confession. It's not confession in the sense of the word that, I confess this, like you're squeezing out a confession from somebody who did something wrong. And confession is just to say, confess means to say the same as, okay? It's like, it's a term of agreement that it's what we profess, what we say the same as, the high priest of what we profess. So Jesus, the high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. So it's, I'll get to that idea of faithfulness, okay? It means full of faith. It also means to be, to honor what you do, like what you say that you're going to do, and to be true to somebody, right? So now here, it says he was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted more worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. So it's saying that Jesus is the builder, right? Now check out what it says in verse 4. For every house is built by somebody. It doesn't appear by its on its own, but the builder of all things is God. So what is that saying? If it's saying here that Jesus is the builder of the house, and then that the builder of all things is God, that Jesus is God, right? So this is one of those verses that like pretty much like tells you that Jesus is God, because he's the builder of the house, and the builder of the house is God. Now Moses, who was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were spoken later. So here he is, Moses is painted here as a servant. Christ is going to be portrayed as a son. So if you're thinking about like a Roman household, you have the pater familia, who's the home father, right? Who's the head of the house. He will have his family, and he's going to have his servants. His family gain in the inheritance. The servants work there. Okay, they're servants. They're not on the same. They're not in the same category. They don't enjoy the same. They don't enjoy the same benefits. The servants don't just go raiding the fridge whenever they want to. You know, the kids, they're going to inherit the house, right? So, and really, Moses is part of the house. He's a servant in the house, but he's also part of the house because this is the house that Jesus is building, right? Now, I want you to catch this here. Now, Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. Okay, so again, it's not that Moses is going to, is doing everything that he's doing. Let me rephrase that. Moses is doing what he's doing in light of the gospel that was going to be revealed later. Okay, Moses is doing is building the temple and doing his ministry as, I would say, like a prophetic foretaste of what Christ would fulfill later. Okay, that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. He's to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. So this is something that's not in Moses's time, but Moses is building and working as a servant in the house in order to bring witness to the things that would happen later. Okay, but Christ is faithful, and Christ is the real thing, because Christ is the one that Moses is testifying to for things later, right? Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. So both have to be faithful. We have to be faithful as sons. We have to be faithful as servants too. And, you know, Christ did act as a servant, but he acted as a servant well, we won't get into that too much. You know, of course, he had to be made into a servant, and he took on the role of a servant, but really he's the heir. And along with him, his brothers are co-heirs, which is us. So Christ is faithful over God's house as his son, and we are his house. Now, I made a note here. It says it's the same house. There's a lot of, you could say Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. We are his house. In other words, the church, right? But people make in their minds kind of like a separation between church and Israel. All that the word church, the church comes from, it's the word ekklesia in Greek, okay? All that ekklesia means the assembly. And the assembly has been spoken about all through the Old Testament. Usually, a lot of times, the assembly was spoken of the divine council was referred to as the assembly, right? It's the household of God's rulership. It's where it's the heavenly council where decisions about heaven and earth are made from. You know, to reiterate the divine council kind of language. It's not as if we have a church that's a separate entity. This is kind of where it's hard for me sometimes to think about it that way, just because I was raised so much in a dispensational kind of background, right? Which really, when you're looking at the Bible carefully, it's dispensationalism where you're saying, well, the God is dealing with the church separately from Israel and those sorts of things. It's just not there. And the way that Paul describes it in one passage, of course, is that we're grafted into that household of Israel. Romans 11. Thank you. And so we have like we have a household that is an assembly, what you would call what we could call the church, that includes the Old Testament saints. It is Moses. It is Daniel. It is the ones who were called the holy ones in the Old Testament. It's not as if now we may be there may be a new covenant, but that covenant is given to the same house. So it's a covenant given to Israel, and the Gentiles started coming into that and started including themselves into the house of Israel. Paul will often talk to Gentiles as if Abraham was their father, as if our forefathers, including Abraham, Moses, and Joshua, and all these, he talks to Gentiles as if it's their history, because he's including them in the household of Israel, basically. Not national Israel, but the household of faith. This is the house that is being talked about here. So it's the same house. And we are that house if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Again, it's that warning. There's not like Hebrews is not telling you once saved, always saved. Okay. Hebrews is telling you once saved, always saved if you hold on. And so there's always that calling and a warning to hold on. Remain faithful, exactly. So therefore, we're here at verses 7 through 11. We'll just read this right through and then we'll go back to 7. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and I saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And the writer of Hebrews is quoting Psalm 95, 7 through 11 there. So for that reason, don't, the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, okay, we're going to get more into that theme of today, because if you think about the original context of that would be the Jews in the wilderness who are rebelling, and then God swears they're not going to enter my rest. And what you have in mind at that point is that they're not going to enter into the promised land, into Canaan, right? And of course, that generation has to die off, and then except for a few of them, like Joshua and Caleb, and they and God is saying that. Now, by the time you get to the Psalms 95, though, this is way past Moses, and they're in the land of Canaan. They're in Israel now, So in that psalm, it says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And it puts that same day, it puts it in the present for that day in Israel. In other words, the writer of the psalm is not saying back then when God said that. He's saying today it's the same situation. If you harden your hearts, you're not going to enter his rest. So that day still remains. Now we'll explain that a little bit more clearly in chapter 4, but I just wanted to point that out for now. So therefore I was provoked with that generation, and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they will not enter my rest. We're going to describe that rest here in a second. Okay, actually now, so let's talk about God's rest, okay? Because we're familiar with the Sabbath. We're also familiar with the fact that God rested on the seventh day. One of the things that we don't tend to see quite as easily, like in our modern context, we don't really have a category of, is that in the ancient Near East, when a king would rest on his throne, okay, if you were, it's ruling language. Part of it is ruling language, okay? It's that once you have established a kingdom, or if you were like in the old pagan creation accounts, once a god had ordered certain things, ordered the cosmos, or ordered a land the way that he wanted to, he would rest. A lot of times you would build a temple and that god would rest in that temple. right? And it's a ruling language. In other words, he's done the work of organizing and taking chaos and making order out of it. And now what you're doing is you're building a temple that, and you make an image in that temple, an idol is what we would call it, right? And then that God would rest in that temple, and there would be like a mouth opening ceremony for the idol, and it was believed that God would actually inhabit that temple. It would be kind of the equivalent to the Holy of Holies, like on the innermost part of the temple, and that he would animate or inhabit that image, right? The word is selim, right? Well, in the biblical narrative, it's a message to the pagan world. It's saying that God made his own temple with his own hands, and that he created man as his own image. And when he came and rested in the temple that he created, he put man in charge to represent him as his image. It's the same kind of language that a pagan would kind of use to describe their pagan god. So and then that it's that idea of resting in that place. Okay, it doesn't mean that you're sitting idle and that you're not doing anything and that you're just relaxing or something like that. The idea is that you're done with your creative work and ordering your making an order out of your realm, your kingdom, or the world that you just created or whatever, and now you're resting and ruling from that place. So after ordering creation, God settled in the rule of an ordered, stable, and secure cosmos. Adam was assigned as the caretaker of that ordered paradise or the garden, okay? And was at rest with God until he disobeyed. So Adam was at rest with God. I mean, he had things to do and he was working, but he was in the presence of God and he was enjoying in the garden the blessing of God's good nature, right? So it was because he messed up. So humanity is exiled. He's exiled out of that garden into a world of disorder, unrest, and toil. It's a wilderness. In other words, this is the original exile. So again, when like the Hebrews had come out of Babylon, they realized that that the world's story was one of exile. That their journey out of exile, whether it was Egypt or whether it was Babylon, was to go back to a promised land. It's to go back to an Eden, and it would be sort of like Mount Zion, right? All of the imagery within a temple or within, like when you look at Revelation at the new heavens, new earth, new Jerusalem, Mount Zion is Eden imagery. Okay, it's where man and God are exist in harmony with each other, and it's God's good ordered universe, and man is participating in that. Okay, so, but of course he gets exiled into this world of disorder, unrest, and toil. He's in the wilderness, which sounds familiar because we're talking about wilderness experiences, like coming out of Egypt, for example. And so the story of the scripture is the restorative work. So God making things right through covenant, to invite and allow his people to return to Eden. So come back to Eden and to be at rest with him again. This time it's going to be in the new creation, or what Eden was supposed to become in the long run. Okay, it's the ultimate Eden. So we know that God blessed the Sabbath. Okay, so let's talk about the Sabbath for a second. He made it holy because you are the idea is that you're going to take a rest, but you're also going to be in the presence of God, and you're going to partake of the good things of God's good creation. It's like you got to let go of the toil and that, kind of step away from the curse as much as you can, like where, like thorns and briars are like in the way and everything is cursed. and just have a day of rest where you're thinking about God, being in the presence of God and enjoying his good creation, right? So we can take a break from that chaos and everything that we experience outside of the garden, but we can also still, in a sense, enjoy God's presence. It's an invitation to enjoy the blessing of creation, and it harkens back to the garden. So the promised land that the Israelites had was that they're promised to be led into this land of milk and honey, okay, flowing with milk and honey, and where we saw fruit that grew this big and all that kind of stuff. So it's a picture of God's rest and Eden. However, they did not enter God's rest even when they were there due to disobedience. That's why David is later writing in the Psalms saying to those present day Hebrews, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts and enter into that rest. So there was a continual invitation into that rest, and disobedience has kept them out of it. Okay. So later on, the writer of Hebrews is going to point out that that Joshua didn't actually guide them into that rest, because they still really didn't step in by faith to enter that rest. So here's the article by Ed Jarrett, and if you want the link or something later on, you can ask me for it. But he says this: God's rest is a state or a place where God rules and manages his creation, free from the chaos and disorder brought on by sin and rebellion. It is God's kingdom. All who will rest from their own work and the work of bringing your own life and world under control, and how well is that working out for you, can enter into God's rest. So we end up resting from our own works and relying on God's work, because we know that he actually took chaos and made order out of it, and we try to do that, but we're not that successful at it. We would generally call this salvation. Okay, it's a way to look at salvation. And God's rest would equate to the kingdom of God. So I hope that's kind of helpful, like when we're talking about like what God's rest is. Okay, so he says there in verse 12, take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have come to share in Christ, if indeed, again, we hold our original confidence firm to the end. As it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. So he's saying you've got to hold on. You've got this faith, but you got to hold on to it. Okay. So here, there's this note here I've got on Deuteronomy 5 and the burning bush. Okay, so this idea here of the living God. Let me go back there. This terminology, fall away from the living God. It comes from, you'll see this language in Deuteronomy 5, and it's language that refers to the burning bush and the God who speaks from Mount Sinai. Not so it's kind of like it brings you back to that the whole scenery that you have in your mind there. Just hearing the word the living God is from passages that are describing Moses and the Israelites there at Sinai and with the burning bush, and everything from the burning bush to Mount Sinai and when they're over there and in the wilderness. So all of this is kind of like using the same imagery over and over again. For who are those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? This Greek word is apatheus. I don't know how to say that. But so we see that they were unable to enter because of their unbelief. This is apostan. These are words that are related apparently to apostasy, okay? Unbelief and being disobedient. And the reason that I'm bringing these up is because we have our language is, we have words that mean their idea of unbelief, or the words that they use for unbelief or disobedience, those sorts of things carry meanings that our word in English, unbelief, don't carry. Okay. Yeah, it means that they didn't believe, but there's a bigger concept here. So I want to talk a little bit about what unbelief is, but first I have to talk of what belief is, and before, or faith. And before I talk about that, I want to lay out a little bit of like between sin and righteousness. You had a question?
Kind of like the salt that loses its flavor.
The salt that loses its flavor.
Yeah, you know, where salt and light, as you know, Jesus says in Matthew 5:13-16. And then the salt that loses its flavor is good for nothing, you know, but be cast out on the dunghill.
Probably.
Basically, you know, it's figurative meaning for those who continue in something, but don't see it through to the end. Yeah,
there's a lot. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot, and there's a lot of you know, like the seed that's sown, and then when you get to the last categories, you know, like the you know, some people start out well and they have root and everything, but they start growing, and then the thorns start cutting it off, cutting out their life, you know, and they start becoming ineffective, and the parable of the sower and the seed. Yeah. So there's different shades of this, and it's all kind of like related to each other. So let me go back, okay, just so that we see this a little bit more clearly. There's this idea of righteousness, and so we'll start there, okay? Righteousness, we will define, you know, you've probably heard defined as right standing. In other words, that you have right standing with God. It's not necessarily based on you having done all the right things, but that you have a good standing with God, okay? There's an idea in righteousness, especially in the Old Testament, which is it's a right standing in a relationship, or it's the fulfillment of an obligation in a relationship. In other words, let's talk about like covenant for a while. So like if you were in a covenant, so like you and I, as say, like I have a relationship with my wife, which is a covenant, you know, as well. But like there are certain things that we fulfill to each other, may not exist in other relationships, but those are kinds of our terms of the covenant. It's like, and do you swear to do this is, I do, you know, etc. Now in a business relationship, it's going to be different, but that righteousness exists as long as you end up your end of the bargain, I'm holding up my end of the bargain. We have righteousness. Okay. Sin would be to step out of that. Hey, you cheated me. You said you promised me this much money to back me up on it, or you promised this much product. You only gave me this much, or whatever. You know, that's where like there's a breach in the righteousness, which is a way that you can kind of understand like what sin is. Okay, so violation of a covenant is sin. Now, when you made a covenant in the ancient world, what you would do is that you would take some animal or animals, and you would cut them in half, and then you would place them on two sides, and then both parties would meet in the middle of those cut animals, and they would make their agreement. And the idea is, so you cut a covenant. Okay, now the idea is that if I don't uphold my end of this covenant, may it be done to me what was just done to these animals. Okay, it's like it's a blood covenant. It's like, I swear that I'm going to keep up my end of this, and you better keep up your end of this. Otherwise, may you be cut in half, just like these animals were. You know, it's just like signing something in blood. I mean, we probably had that like more like a, you know, maybe 100, 200 years ago, you know, like, but you've heard of that, you know, you sign something in blood, or you and you,
like you on the finger, like a signet.
Yeah, you would, you know, like people, or maybe it was just an expression. I don't know if people actually signed it with their own blood, but it was just sort of a thing that, like, it, you know, like to just show the severity or the depth of it, or your level of commitment. You know, your level of commitment is to death. You know, and so that's like what you do is like you cut a covenant. Now, there was a covenant made with Abraham where he takes the time and does, you know, God tells him, okay, split apart these animals. We're going to do a covenant. So he takes these animals, he cuts them in half, and he's dead tired after this probably. And so he falls asleep on the side there. But when he wakes up, it's God that's between the animals, but he's not in there. Okay. And God swears by himself. He says, I swear by myself, because like, if you're God, what else can you swear by? You know, it's like, you know, like we might say, I swear to God or whatever, but like God's like, I got nothing higher than myself. So I'm swearing by myself that I'm going to build a nation out of you. And he gives him all these promises and all that. And what's Abraham's part in that? You know, Abraham's not between the animals, right? So, and it says that Abraham believed God, and that was counted to him as righteousness. Yes. So his fulfillment of that obligation in that relationship, in that covenant, was to trust God, that God was going to do what he said. That's what faith is. Okay. Faith is trusting God, that God's going to do what he says. And that's what Abraham operates out of. And and we being children of Abraham, that's what we operate out of. It's not that we were between the animals and said, if we do this, then we've upheld our part of the bargain. God's never going to owe us anything. You know, it's that God promised, and our part of the bargain is to believe that. So that was Abraham's end of that covenant. You know, so if you think about like that faith, okay, that kind of faith, it's a believing loyalty. He believes God, but he's also going to be loyal to God. And it involves belief, trust, loyalty, what we would call faithfulness. We actually have a little bit of an overlap in the English language. When we say faithful, we don't mean just believing something. We mean being following through, being true to that belief, right? And it would include obedience, etc. So it's a set of ideas. Okay, the opposite would be unbelief. Okay, unbelief is also it's mistrusting or not trusting. I don't trust God. It's disloyalty to God. It's faithlessness, or you could say unfaithfulness. Okay, and of course disobedience, etc. So sin in this context, as far as we're talking about it here, is not so much about like like individual no-nos that you do. Oh, you sinned because you said a bad word, or you did this, or looked at the wrong thing, or put the wrong thing, you ate the wrong thing, or whatever like that. It's more about the unfaithfulness it's more about unfaithfulness or faithlessness. Okay, that's the big breach of our covenant agreement that the Hebrews writer is talking about. He's not talking about like boy, you end up piling on a bunch of no-nos and eventually sin so bad that like now you can't come back, or he's talking about trusting, believing, being loyal, and this big general idea of faithfulness. So I'll give you an example of this. And I love this example because the writer of Hebrews uses it as an example. And so we're going to talk about Rahab. Okay, she's the harlot who was there at Jericho. So think of it this way: a generation of Israel, and we just talked about this generation of Israel that dies in the desert because of their unbelief. Okay, they didn't trust God, so God gave them, they didn't trust God to give them victory over the inhabitants of the promised land. God promised something, but they didn't believe. Okay, that's what, opposite of Abraham. He promises Abraham something, and Abraham's not perfect in his belief, but he does trust God enough to say, okay, whatever you say, me, an old man having a kid, whatever, but you're God. Okay, so Joshua, who's actually named Yeshua, it's just like Jesus, right? The Jewish name for Jesus is Yeshua. It's Joshua. He leads a new generation into the promised land. So he is he's a type of Christ. He's going to lead the people into the promised land out of the wilderness. And he sends spies. Now, they'd sent spies before under Moses, but those spies came back with a bad report. They're like, I don't think that we can take these guys. And, these guys weren't fearful at all of us, and we looked like ants to them and all that kind of stuff, So, but this time Joshua sends in spies, just like what's been done before. And Rahab actually hides these spies, right? But here Rahab tells these spies the opposite of what their spies a generation ago had said, because she says, I know that the Lord has given you the land. So the original spies that were sent out under Moses were saying, God, they doubted that God had given them the land. We can't take this land, is what they were saying, right? These people are too mighty for us. Okay, and she says, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have despaired because of you. She's saying the opposite of what they're saying. They're saying, we're afraid of you, okay, because of your God, basically. And then she starts talking about all these great things that Yahweh has done. He brought you through the Red Sea. He, appeared in smoke, and he did all these mighty works. And yeah, we're scared witless about this Yahweh of yours because, he is a great and terrible God. That's like what she's saying. I'm saying terrible as in awesome and, scary, terrible in the right way, but and she starts citing God's, much to fear, right? And she cites God's great acts. She does the exact opposite of what that generation before were saying. Okay, so she fears Yahweh on behalf of, Yahweh, and she acts on behalf of him. Now, think of what she's doing. She is a pagan. She's growing up with other gods. Okay, she's not going to be loyal to those gods anymore. She's going to abandon those gods. In fact, she's even going to abandon her city. And she's going to be loyal to Yahweh from that moment forward. So for her, it's exactly believing loyalty. She believes not just that Yahweh exists, but she believes that she should be under him, and that her loyalty should be to him. And so she's going to convert, basically, right? And she even sets up her own town. She's like, she kisses her own hometown and her own people and her own gods goodbye. She switches sides, is what she does. And she joins Israel, and she becomes a descendant of David. She's like the great grandmother of David, whatever. And therefore, she actually becomes a descendant of Jesus. And she gets mentioned there in Matthew and everything. Yeah. Huh? Jesus is the descendant of her. Okay, yeah, no. Ancestor. I should have said ancestor, not descendant. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Also mentioned in James chapter 2 as well.
Okay, James chapter 2 mentions that. Well, the encyclopedia here. Rahab in Hebrews. So Rahab gets a special mention. We're going to read about her again when we get to the Hall of Faith passage in Hebrews 11. It says there, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient. It's that same word, the word that I can't pronounce, okay? Now think about that. She didn't perish with those who were disobedient. Is the writer of Hebrews talking about Jericho? Because if he's talking about Jericho, how is Jericho disobedient to Yahweh? The only way that I can think of that being the case is just the fact that they don't believe in Yahweh or they don't fear Yahweh, right? But is the writer of Hebrews here maybe also saying that she doesn't perish like the children in the wilderness did? She's actually got faith, and she's not acting. In any case, she's not acting like the disobedient. Okay, you're thinking, wait, she's a harlot. Okay, it's not the point here. The point is that like she doesn't perish with those who are disobedient, and maybe her being a prostitute is part of like the story is like, even though she's a prostitute, she doesn't perish along with the people who are disobedient in other ways as well. But she's spared in any case because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. I think that's kind of like a just from that act, it shows you where she stood, and where, you know, it shows you again, like the story that how we just went through it, that, you know, that she was actually showing great faith in that moment, and she knew that like her hometown wasn't going to stand, that this God could do anything, and that's who she wanted to be with.
She continued to be a prostitute.
I don't think she continued to be a prostitute after. No. And
but when it's mentioned though, it's like, so here she was what she was, and yet what happened? Her life changed.
I don't think that like in her culture that like prostitution was carried the same sort of baggage that like some, you know, women, if you didn't have a husband or something like that, you know, then you had very few choices, or you had no choices, you know. And then B, it was part of their worship. Sometimes she could be like a prostitute, like as a temple prostitute or something, and part of their pagan worship system. So she may not have been like looked down on the same way or whatever, you know. This is a different set of. Now, of course, she had to fall in line and conform to the laws that, you know, God wasn't going to allow her to be part of Israel and be a prostitute, you know. But, you know, that's no problem, you know, especially since God was like, I won't allow you to have any other gods either. You got to abandon those gods and come to me if you're going to do that, you know. Like you'll be one of my people and I'll be your God, you know, and have no other God before me. So here's the bigger picture, kind of moving forward to this. In chapters 2, this is the closing slide, by the way. So in chapter 2, we were shown how Christ delivers us from slavery of the fear of death. Okay. Here in chapter 3, we're brought back to Moses, who was delivering the people out of slavery from Egypt. So it's kind of a backward, you know, we know that Jesus is better than Moses, but he's already portrayed as being a bigger deliverer, and not just out of Egypt, but out of death itself, or fear of death itself. So it's already kind of like making these parallels. Moses led the people out of Egypt, out of slavery. Jesus, the new Yeshua, a new Joshua, is delivering people from death itself. So we're seeing a comparison of like these two periods of history and how they correlate to each other. So Jesus being the one who's bringing them into a promised land, just as Moses was leading them into a promised land. Okay, so we're looking at the imagery of Sinai, you know, out in the wilderness, and the journey that the Israelites took around it. And this is going to, and we're going to compare it to the imagery of Mount Zion. It's basically going to be God's holy mountain, either way. you know. So and it's going to build up into chapter 12, where it's going to say, you have not come to a mountain full of smoke where you're not going, you know, but you have come to Mount Zion, and we can enter, and we can approach that mountain. We can approach that presence of God. He's inviting us in. So God's rest, Canaan is you know, a picture of God's rest, but God's rest was not Canaan per se. It wasn't necessarily like, you destroy these Canaanites, take over their land, that's going to be your rest. But he's talking about Zion, and Zion, it's God's mountain. You know, we've had a couple discussions here that, you know, actually Eden is pictured as being on a mountain, especially if you look at it, Ezekiel, I think it's 21. You know, you'll find out that, you know, like that cherub, that he anointed cherub, was kicked off of the mountain of God out of Eden. So we know that it's already seen as the mountain of God, where his temple is, where his the Eden is basically, temple is basically based off of Eden. You know, it's where God will meet with man and be in paradise with him. So God's rest wasn't really about Canaan per se, but it was about Mount Zion. And for that matter, it could have been Zion. I mean, Sinai. He gave them the same invitation on Mount Sinai as anywhere else. As, if you come here and approach my mountain, and I want you to be a nation of priests and kings, a royal priesthood. Just like Adam and Eve were priests and kings, and the invitation is still open for us to go up to Mount Zion and to enter God's rest, to be on that mountain in Eden, and be a nation of priests and kings. You know, so. It could have been Sinai. They forfeited it with their unbelief. So in other words, don't run from God's mountain, come to it. And that's kind of like where we're going to be heading, going into chapter 12, where it all kind of comes to a high point. No pun intended.
Like that song, like that song "Come to the Altar."
Mm-hmm. What do you mean they forfeited it? Like
they
How good.
Yeah.
Oh.
God gave them, God's vision for Israel was for them to be a nation of kings and priests. They were going to be, if they wanted to, what's promised to the church today, or it's the same assembly anyway, is to be the ones who are the priests and kings of creation. So what's another way to put it? Yeah, he wanted them to be a royal priesthood, a priesthood. So what was it that
do you think that it could have all been, do you think that just like they could have been in the promised land quicker had they not disobeyed? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's a parallel to now, like Jesus is tarrying his return because of our disobedience, and we're not ready, we're not the glorified church yet?
I don't know. That's a good question. So the question is all these parallels, right? Yeah. So you have all these parallels between Sinai and you have all these parallels. And is it that, you know, so is the writer of Hebrews saying, hey, Israel messed it up because of and we can mess it up because of our unbelief? And is that what would be keeping Christ from returning? Because the church isn't ready. And I can think of a verse that could support that, which would be, he's coming for a glorified church, right? But also to hasten the day of his coming. Where, let's look that up. Where does it say that again? Hasten the day of his return. Let me.
Basically, I understand it from Noah's day that even though, despite all the watchman calls that Noah was making, in his day, they disregarded what he was saying, and then the flood came. And they were all unprepared. Basically, that's going to be the same that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
There's going to be a falling away that happens, and then everybody's going to be caught unprepared. Well, not everybody, but that's why it's good to we must day by day follow the good shepherd Jesus and keep our lamps lit, our spiritual lamps lit, and just obey and encourage others to do the same.
I don't know, I've never thought of it that way, but I have wondered about verses like, as you look forward to the day of the Lord of God and speed is coming, that day will bring about the destruction of heavens by fire. I don't know if that tells us very much. I don't know, but I do, but in any case, there is that, how do I stop sharing this? In any case, at the very least, there is that thought that like you can miss out on God's rest, which means missing out on the new creation because of unbelief. You fall away from the faith, and there's some problems with the way people will understand, at least once saved, always saved sort of ideas. But one of them is that heaven's not going to be full of Baal worshipers, and it's not going to be full of atheists and people who it's the new heavens, new earth isn't going to be ruled by those. It's going to be ruled by it's going to be run and occupied by the faithful. That's who Christ is going to put in there, So,
Ezekiel 18 verses 19 to 32 explains it very, very detailed. If the righteous man falls away and does iniquity and goes away, and his faithfulness, his righteousness shan't be remembered, and
right, yeah.
And then likewise, if the wicked man turns from his wicked way and follows the Lord and basically turns away from, it's under the turn of it. I can read the whole thing, but
yeah. There's too many warnings to be like, well, I answered an altar call when I was 5 years old or something, there's too many warnings in Hebrews to say, say things to the contrary of that. So yeah, you should treat it, like in Revelation, the people who have remained faithful to the end, they're called the overcomers. It's like to him who overcomes, and we always like saying we're overcomers, right? Well, at what point do you become an overcomer? The way that they're portrayed in Revelation is those who were diligent to the end. You're not at your end yet. So you need to pay attention and be diligent about it. That's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. It's not like okay, well, now you got your ticket and go do what you want. It's not like that.
I forget exactly which book it's in, but it says that you may not continue to do what you want. Basically in Ephesians chapter 5 verses 1 to 2 says to imitate God as dear children. That's because we are children of God, and if we go out behaving as the rest of the Gentiles.
Not what's wrong. I couldn't get on my iPad. I had to use my phone for my Bible study.
Okay. You still got your audio on, Sheree?
No, that.
Oh, okay, Angie. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to stop recording at this point.